Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Is it so good to have a lot of good acquaintances? In today's situation, you will find out the answer to this question. Enjoy the show! Just 15 minutes ago, if someone had told me that my wife, May, was having some kind of affair, I would have laughed. Until that moment, I had believed 100% in my wife's fidelity. In fact, I never even considered any wrong scenario. But after what I had just heard, completely new emotions began to arise in me: doubt, mistrust, and anger. It was a real accident. If I hadn't met Don Masters at SeaTac Airport, my world would have remained blissfully and strangely normal. But that didn't happen. The Masters lived next door to us in Bellevue when we first got married and moved into our new house. We bought our house and soon learned that Don and Carolyn Masters were our neighbors. They were 10 years older than us and had 2 school-age children. Over the 2 years that they lived next door, we became friendly, although not quite friends. They eventually moved to Kirkland, and we mostly lost contact with them, except for the occasional Christmas card once a year. When I saw Don at the baggage carousel, I immediately recognized him and greeted him. We stood for a minute, gathering social balance. Don told me he had returned from a business trip to California. I asked about Carolyn and the kids, and he said everything was fine and that both boys were in high school. "Are you single now?" he asked, sounding lonely. "No, May and I just celebrated our 6th anniversary." "Why did you think I was lonely?" I replied. I saw a strange expression on his face. He looked at me, not knowing what to say. "Don?" I asked, reacting to his silence. "Listen," he began, "I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I saw May a few months ago in Los Angeles. It was an accident, just like this meeting." "So what?" I asked, still confused. "But why does that make you think we're not together?" He looked at me with a strange expression on his face. Finally, he answered, "Maybe it's nothing, but I saw her in IL Mangy with her arms around some guy. I was there with clients, and they were at the bar." I knew that May sometimes traveled to Southern California, where Trans-Pacific Financial, her father's company, has an office. She was vice president of the Seattle branch and flew there every month or two. "Are you sure it was May?" I asked, trying to figure out if this was a mistake. "Pretty sure it was her. In fact, as she walked by, we made eye contact, and she kind of waved at me. It was definitely May." I thought for a moment. "Can you describe the guy?" I asked. "Yes, I got a good look at him. Asian, tall, really very tall, thin, dressed in a nice suit. He looked professional." I immediately knew who it was: David Chan. He also worked for Transpac. Chan was her father's golden boy. In fact, if everything had worked out according to her father's wishes, May would have been with him and not with me. I thought for a minute about her father, Long Pham. He never loved me, although he never said it. The fact that May married me bothered him. It was ironic because May's mother seemed to love me. I continued to think after everything I had heard when Masters interrupted my thoughts. "Here's my luggage. I have to go." With one last worried look on his face, he patted me on the shoulder and told me to take care of myself. After battling the usual terrible Puget Sound traffic, I finally made it home a little before 7 p.m. I entered the house and saw May with her phone and headphones on, walking around the living room. She smiled at me and waved her hand slightly, then pointed to the headphones. "I was solving some business problems," I said. My office was on the first floor near the entrance. I was a residential building contractor, usually building 2 or 3 houses a year and making good money. I sat down at my desk and put aside the information from Don Masters for a moment. On my desk was a large map of a new community I was developing called Samish Meadows. This was definitely a bigger project than I had ever taken on. There were 40 sites. I had poured all my resources into this project and still needed help. To my surprise, the funding came from Transpac and May's father, Long Pham. I hoped that the business relationship would strengthen our personal relationship, but that did not happen. Eventually, May ended the call. She kissed me when I entered the kitchen, but she noticed my lack of enthusiasm in response to her kiss. "Bad day?" she asked. My thoughts were racing all the way home. Should I ignore what Masters said? Should we hire a detective to get evidence, or just ask her directly? Maybe there was some logical explanation. I sat down on the stool, turned, and looked at her. I chose the third option. I met Don Masters at SeaTac Airport, I said, and looked at her. She was holding up well, but I noticed a slight flash of panic on her face. May didn't answer. So, this is David Chan, I asked again. She paused, finally overwhelmed. She took a deep breath and answered, Devin, it doesn't mean anything. David has been a family friend for a long time. I love you, you are my husband. Everything with David doesn't matter. I felt my heart starting to break. I looked at May, beautiful, smart. She was fun to be with, and 90 minutes ago, I would have added reliable. It was hard to say that now. Devin, please, she begged. This means nothing. I'm breaking up with David. Please, let's get through this. It does not matter. I need to think, I answered gloomily. I'll sleep here tonight, I said, nodding toward my office. Devin, no, please. Come to bed with me, she begged. I met May at a party thrown by mutual friends. She had recently moved to Seattle from Southern California. I had always been attracted to women of her type. She was of mixed ethnicity. She later explained that her father was Vietnamese and her mother's family was French. Her father was in the financial business, and they were building a presence in the Puget Sound area, which brought her to Seattle to open a branch. She complained about the weather but also noted the beauty of the mountains and water. That evening, I invited her to my boat, and the next day she agreed. We found a common language and soon began meeting regularly. I remember when I first met her parents. It was her mother's birthday, and her father asked me to fly to California to help celebrate. We met her father, Long, and her mother, Sophia, at the Capitol Grill. I was not told that my presence would be a surprise, at least for her father. When I introduced myself, I was met with a stony look and a limp handshake. This greeting set the tone for our future relationship. He never loved me. I never knew if he thought I wasn't suitable for his daughter, or if it was because of our differences, or perhaps it was just a general dislike. I never fully understood it. When I asked her about his unfriendly attitude, May simply laughed. It's just my dad, she smiled and told me. He can be grumpy sometimes. I knew what grumpiness was, and that wasn't what I got from Long. I would rather call it hatred. We eventually got married, and although her father paid most of the wedding expenses, any act of kindness on his part was entirely focused on May. After our marriage, his attitude towards me did not change. May's mother was always polite and treated me well, but there was no doubt who was dominant in the family. Long was in charge. Years later, when I had the opportunity to purchase the piece of land that would become Samish Meadows, financing came from Long and Trans-Pacific Financial. May suggested we talk to her father about the opportunity, and over the months as we finalized the deal, Long improved. We did have conversations about the project, and he seemed to become more accepting of me. This did not lead to a long-term rapport between us, but there was a slight warming. I was used to the nature of our relationship and tried not to let it bother me too much. I barely slept that night. It had nothing to do with the uncomfortable couch. One of the main pillars of our relationship was destroyed, confidence. I tried to imagine forgiveness, and somehow I felt that I could muster up enough emotion to forgive her. What I didn't think I could get back was trust. I imagined my anxiety every time she went to California. Would I think she would end up in bed with David Chan or with someone else? Somehow, in my deep, swirling thoughts, I started blaming her father. I could imagine him trying to arrange for Chan to interfere in our marriage. One thing that hadn't changed was my distrust of Long. I never trusted him. Finally, after a long night of tossing and turning, I decided not to make a decision right away. Divorce was certainly an option, but I wanted to see if I could forgive her and trust her again. Over the next few weeks, we tried to act like a married couple. We discussed her affair with Chan until I finally told her one night, I don't want to talk about that guy anymore. It's been a stressful and unnatural few weeks. We made love, but the depth of affection we usually had was missing. I wasn't sure we were making any progress. One evening, she came home with a darker expression on her face. The tensions in our home, which were already high, increased. Finally, she told me what was going on. I have to go to California next week. I will be there for 4 days, she said, lowering her eyes and not looking at me. I sat there, processing and analyzing this news. Will Chan be there? I asked calmly. She looked at me, still not looking directly at me, and nodded slightly, confirming his presence. Tensions in our home increased in the days leading up to her trip. She begged me to forgive her, and I rarely answered. It was becoming unbearable. The morning was quiet on the day of her departure. She insisted on taking Uber to the airport. I was happy. I wanted to avoid another hour of awkward conversation in the car. It was partly during her trip that I decided we couldn't continue like this. As I went through all my options, I unfortunately realized that divorce was the only solution. My trust in her was completely destroyed. After some time searching, I found a divorce lawyer. I wasn't looking for a bloodthirsty shark, I just wanted a quiet and fair breakup. In fact, with the prenuptial agreement her father insisted on, there was no doubt about the division of property. She returned that Thursday evening, and I placed the divorce papers on the dining room table. I told her we needed to take them to the district court. She begged and cried, professing her love for me. I wasn't heartless, and there were times when I hugged her and apologized. "Devin, please," she said, tears running down her cheeks. "Let's not make a decision right away. Let's try a little. I think we can overcome this." The next day, I received a call I never expected. It was her father, Long Pham. "My daughter May is not happy," he stated. "You need to leave everything as it is," he continued. "I need you to forget about the divorce. Make me happy, Long." "That is, Mr. Pham," I began. "This is a problem between May and me. I appreciate your concern, but this is something we need to work out together. I hope you understand." "I don't care," he almost screamed into the phone. "I just need my daughter to be happy and my wife to be happy. For some reason I don't understand, she wants to stay married. I expect you to accept it." And without a goodbye, the conversation ended. It was obvious that Long was used to getting his way. We had 2 or 3 more tearful conversations, but in the end, the trust issue was one I couldn't imagine overcoming. After our last conversation, she went to her room, and I thought I heard a long, muffled telephone conversation. I was pretty sure who she was talking to. By the weekend, we were discussing the practicalities of our failed marriage, who would live where and who would get which piece of furniture. Gone was the loving attitude that had symbolized our marriage just a few weeks ago. Now, I saw a new side of May, and she seemed very much like her father. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a small apartment in Renton, with May staying in the house. I was working on my development project. Once everything came together, I was going to make a lot of money. At least this was one positive event in my life, I thought. That morning, I received a call from the office of Maplewood Road and Paving, the contractor who paved roads in Samish Meadows. "We need the next payment," the accountant told me. I thought. There should have been an automatic payment. Why was the payment not transferred? I told them there must have been a small mistake. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." I called the finance company and asked for an expedited payment for Maplewood. There was a pause, and I was put on hold. When the representative came online again, she directed me to a phone number in California. At that moment, I wasn't worried, I was just annoyed by all the running around. I called Trans-Pacific's California number and asked about the planned funding for my project. I was put on hold again, and then, a few minutes later, a new voice came on the line. "David Chan. How can I help you?" I froze for a minute without answering him. "Hello?" he asked. "Yes, this is Devin Baxter," I began. I had a scheduled loan transfer that was not completed. I would like to see it expedited to pay the suppliers. "Devin," he began. "We've met a few times, yes? Let me take up your case." I heard him tapping on the keys as he looked through the files. Finally, he came online again. "Okay," he said slowly, as if reading a document. "Have you recently spoken to Mr. Pham, about this matter?" "I didn't talk to him," I replied, asking why. He told me that the loan was suspended, but no specific reasons were given. Only that Long Pham, my former father-in-law, had stopped funding the project. When I asked if he was there, Chan said he was in Asia for a week and wasn't expected back until Monday. A sudden sense of panic spread through my chest. Would this idiot really do this to me? I sat down and thought about how I had invested everything I had into a piece of land that would become Samish Meadows, almost $400,000. My loan from Transpac for the remainder was secured by land. I needed funding from Transpac to develop the land and turn it into cash flow. With the loan suspended, I could not move forward. I called May 3 times before she finally returned my call. May, I began. Your father stopped funding the Samish Meadows project. I can't move on without it. I need your help, I said, trying to suppress my despair and panic. She listened and said little. Finally, she said that she would talk to her father, but at the moment he was abroad. I tried to convey a sense of urgency about this issue, but she seemed indifferent to my situation, as if she didn't care. This was the same woman who had begged me not to get a divorce just a few weeks ago. I logged off and reviewed the original loan documents again. I still had an ownership interest in some of the land, but this property was not liquid. May's father had complete control over the entire development. I considered talking to another lender, but as I read the agreement, Transpac had a majority stake and could delay the project as long as they wanted. I was a single person with extremely limited resources. How could I fight against a large global financial corporation with unlimited resources? After calling May several times, begging her to get her father to call me, I finally received a call from Long Pham on Friday afternoon. Mr. Baxter, this is Long Pham. How can I help you? He began. The formality of his greeting immediately put me on guard. I calmly discussed the Samish Meadows development situation, the agreed payment plan, and the need to continue the project to stay on schedule. After I outlined the logic of my request, there was a pause. Finally, he answered, "We are suspending all investment in residential property for now. We will postpone this and several other projects until the end of the year and review them then." Although he and I were never close, I was married to his daughter, yet I was treated with the same indifference as an ordinary stranger. I quickly began reviewing the numbers for Samish Meadows, finally asking what the problem was with continuing the loan. As I already explained, I said, irritation creeping into my voice, "We are suspending these loans for the near future. Unfortunately, I have another meeting that I have to go to." "All the best," he said, and the phone went dead. I tried to continue appealing through May, but after a while, she also stopped answering my calls. I considered legal action but then thought about the practical nature of my current financial situation. I was worried about raising money for rent at the end of the month. I definitely didn't have money for a lawyer. I was really in a quandary, betrayed by May's father and my own misplaced trust in him. I thought if May had not violated my trust, and we had remained married, there is no doubt that my housing project would not have been put on hold. I'm not going to go into detail about the next 2 months, let's just say I hit rock bottom. I turned to alcohol to numb the pain of my professional and financial failures, not to mention the failure of my marriage. Despite her infidelity, I still had feelings for May. On the other hand, she seemed incapable of any emotion towards me. It's a skill I'm sure she inherited from her father. I tried to find a job in construction to at least avoid being evicted from my small apartment. My unstable mental state, coupled with excessive alcohol consumption, eliminated any job opportunities. I was on the edge. I borrowed from friends and relatives. My only asset, my interest in the Samish Meadows land, was entirely under the control of Transpac and Long Pham. I was facing eviction next week. I sold my car and any other personal items that had even the slightest value. My boat was sold when I first raised funds for development. My thoughts turned to dark places as I contemplated my future. Then, out of the blue, that night I received a strange letter. It was from someone calling himself El Kanakis. He owned a business called SSI. I read the rather long letter while drinking the last of the cheap whiskey. SSI was the parent company of some high-end health clubs on the Greek island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. As I understood it, they served wealthy clients, offering exercise, yoga, Pilates, and nutritional programs with healthy foods. In addition, there were classes on lifestyle longevity, psychology, and a variety of personal enhancements. I did a quick search and found that it was a legitimate business. They had an impressive professional website. I scrolled through photographs of beautiful whitewashed buildings, various classes, the impressive blue color of the sea, and the sunny areas of the complex. At the end of the letter, Kanakis indicated that he wanted to talk to me about the position of caretaker. Their current caretaker was retiring and returning to the mainland. I read the last sentence. If you're interested, I'd love to talk to you via Zoom tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time. If you are not interested, please kindly decline the offer. Then there were instructions for the Zoom call. That was all. How did he know about me? Luckily, there wasn't enough alcohol in my system to get me drunk. I looked out at the bleak climate of Western Washington in early spring, and then I went back to the Santorini Spa website. It was like a fairyland. The comparison between the two environments was stark. My interest began to grow. I decided there was no harm in learning more about this opportunity. At this point, it was the only option I had. The next day at 9:30 a.m., I connected to Zoom with Mr. Leonidas Kanakis. "Good morning, Mr. Baxter," he began by way of introduction. "I am Leonidas Kanakis." His English was accented, as if he had studied somewhere in Western Europe. "Perhaps you have done some research on our complex in Santorini. This is a very special place, and the demand for our services is high. Currently, there is a waiting list of 2 years. Because of all this activity, there is a constant need for repairs. This is where we need your skills." He continued to talk about the normal responsibilities that come with being a caretaker. He then elaborated a little more about the complex and touched on compensation issues. A small apartment and free access to dining facilities were part of the package. While listening to him, I noticed his charm and began to like him. He seemed pleasant and friendly. I could use some nice and friendly things going on in my life right now. "So," he began, "should I ask you about your level of interest in this proposal?" He caught me off guard, and I faltered in my response, saying that it all sounded interesting and that I needed to think about it. "Mr. Baxter," he said to me, his face suddenly serious. "My current caretaker is leaving within the week. I need to find someone quickly. You are at the top of my list, but if it doesn't suit you, I have to move on to the next candidate." I thought about it. It really sounded wonderful, and I didn't have many options. Nothing connected me here anymore. "No, Mr. Kanakis, I'm quite interested." It just came as a surprise to me. Okay, the charming smile suddenly reappeared. "I'll send you the contract today. It will contain all the details of your trip." He talked a little more and said we'd be in touch. At the very end of our conversation, I asked him a question. "Mr. Kanakis," I asked, "how did you know my name?" "Ah, Mr. Baxter, may I call you Devin?" he asked. "It's a long story. We can discuss it when you arrive." With that, our Zoom call was over. 2 weeks later, I found myself on a British Airways flight to Athens. From Athens, I had to take a small plane to the east and then take a ferry to Santorini. The package included a modest monthly salary, a small apartment, and access to the resort's dining facilities. Despite my relatively low income, I realized that I would have almost no expenses. Before leaving, I sent May a letter explaining that I was leaving the area and provided her with a post office box address in the small town of Marassi, where the ferry docked. Her answer was silence. This chapter of my life seemed to be completely over. When I finally got off the ferry, I had been traveling for over 24 hours. We landed in a town called Paros. Several boats with materials were unloading at the pier. I read that Santorini has a small fishing industry, but the main source of income is tourism. Then I heard a horn from an open SUV. A large figure motioned me towards the parking lot. "Mr. Devin Baxter?" It was more of a statement than a question from the big man behind the wheel of the car. I extended my hand for a handshake. He looked at my hand for a moment and then shook it lightly. "I'm Devin," I said kindly. "And you?" He hesitated and then said, "Amir." I studied Amir, a big man 3 or 4 inches taller than my 6-foot height. He must have weighed 250 pounds, not much of it was fat. He appeared to be of Middle Eastern origin, possibly Turkish. He wasn't talkative, and we drove in silence for 20 minutes to the resort. The Santo Resort and Spa was terraced on a hillside, with a white sandy beach below in front of a calm blue-green sea. At the eastern end of the beach, there was a small pier with one boat. It was a Sea Ray cruiser. From the beach, the complex had 5 levels. The first one was where Mir dropped me off, and it looked like employee housing. The smallest buildings housed storage areas for equipment and supplies. There was a small workshop with various tools and equipment. My apartment was simple, one room with a small bathroom, a closet, and not much else. I could tell this was once part of a smaller house of 2 or 3 rooms. The rooms outside my living space were neglected and in need of renovation. It seemed to be a random repository of unwanted junk. I soon learned that the second and third levels were where the guests were located and where most of the activities took place. The fourth level contained a cafeteria, classrooms, and several offices. The fifth and top level was the home of the owner, Kanakis. All the structures were painted bright white, which I imagine would require a lot of maintenance in the salty sea air. I received a message from Mr. Kanakis inviting me to dinner with him that evening at 9 o'clock. I spent the rest of the day exploring the complex, meeting a few people, and then getting some sleep before meeting up for dinner. Kanakis' house was the same white as the other buildings in Santo Spa, but there were more luxurious details evident in his home. I knocked on the front door and was silently greeted by the bulky Amir. I hadn't seen a smile on his face yet. He led me to a side terrace, and under the arches, a small table had been set for 2. The Amir nodded towards the table, and I took this as an invitation to sit down. Then, the Amir retreated into the shadow of one of the arches. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stone terrace. It was a woman dressed mostly in black. She initially appeared to be around 50 years old, but could have been anywhere from her mid-40s to early 60s. "I'm Lydia," she said, her hands clasped together, making no gesture of greeting. "I'm the assistant of Leonidas Mr. Kanakis. He will join you soon." She had an accent, presumably Greek. It was difficult to call her attractive. She looked simple and businesslike. "Every day at 8 a.m. we will meet on the level below in the cafeteria. My office is at the end. You are expected to work until 6 p.m. daily. Do you have questions?" Before I could answer, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stone terrace. I recognized Kanakis from our Zoom call. His hand was extended and there was a warm smile on his face. "Mr. Baxter." "Devin," he corrected himself, "it's very nice to see that you made it to our Santorini." With that, he spread his arms out in a warm, all-encompassing gesture of greeting. "Ah," he sighed, "if you had seen Santorini 10 years ago," he shook his head with a sad expression on his face. "You would have seen the real local environment, virtually unchanged for decades. It has become a tourist destination for Europe. Many changes," but he clapped his hands, and his mood turned positive. "All this publicity around Santorini is now very good for our business," he smiled and told me. I looked at him, tall, 2 or 3 inches taller than me, thin, fit, and tanned with a Mediterranean build. He appeared to be in his late 40s, an attractive man with curly dark hair that was turning gray. We sat down and discussed my travels and my review of Santo Spa. A silent waitress brought us a delicious dinner and a bottle of chilled Santorini white wine. During the conversation, I got the slight impression that he was much less interested in what I was saying and much more focused on his own dialogue. Finally, after a very pleasant dinner and mostly pleasant conversation, Kanakis suddenly stood up. "Unfortunately, I will need to leave on business for a few days. If you have any questions, please contact Lydia." With a firm handshake on my shoulder, he turned and walked away, and I heard a door I hadn't seen open and close. For a moment, I just stood there. I eventually made it to my apartment and, jet-lagged, fell into a deep sleep. I woke up early, my body adjusting to the new time zone, and met Lydia in the dining room. I noticed the guests. Although they were of all ages, I would guess most were over 50. They also looked rich. My observation was that Santo Spa was definitely in the luxury category. Today, Lydia was not as harsh as yesterday. We started with a tour of the complex. She then rattled off a long list of things that needed immediate attention. "If you have questions and cannot reach me, please contact Grigos. I had met him before, and he seemed to be the head cleaner, a short, round, pleasant elderly man living in a village in Paris. One more thing, Mr. Baxter, Lydia suddenly became businesslike again. Don't get intimate with our guests. She said it with such an accent that it seemed like it had once been a problem. I nodded in agreement. Basically, the work that was entrusted to me was not technically difficult, it just seemed like there was an endless chain of things that needed some sort of repair. By the second month, I had settled into a rhythm. The work was not difficult, the weather was beautiful, and the surroundings were magnificent. I worked Monday through Friday and was on call on the weekends. The new environment helped me forget about my marriage and business disaster. The closest thing to a friend for me was the happy cleaner, Grigos. He was very pleasant and always had a big smile on his face. If I had basic questions about how something worked at Santo Spa, I usually just turned to Grigos. Lydia was nice, but she made me feel uncomfortable. It was Friday, perhaps my 8th week on the island, and Grigos asked me about my plans for the weekend. I told him I didn't know yet. Young men like you, he said, nodding at me, you will meet other people on the island. Go to Paras's tavern. Many people, beautiful girls, he told me and laughed. I hadn't started exploring outside of the resort yet, but I had been thinking about it. It was about a half-mile walk into town, it sounded interesting. On Friday evening, I took a walk and entered the tavern. It was almost full, seemingly 100% local residents. I saw Gina, one of the cleaning staff at the spa. She waved at me. Gina was sitting with a group of people who I would guess were in their 20s or 30s. She introduced me to everyone, calling out names that I didn't remember. She sat me down next to an attractive, curvy woman named Maria. Maria and I chatted in her broken English and my limited knowledge of a few Greek words. We had a few drinks over the course of a few hours, and I have to admit I had fun. I studied Maria, a curvy woman, not exactly athletic but not overweight either. She had wavy dark hair and something homey about her look. She was not unattractive, just plain. As the evening continued, the conversation became increasingly personal between Maria and me. There were brief touches during the conversation. My thoughts began to move to the next steps with Maria, whether it be tonight or in the future. I excused myself and went to the restroom. As I left the restroom, I glanced around at the crowd in the tavern. The room was filling up. I noticed I was almost back to where I was when I first saw her. I literally froze in place. Through my slightly intoxicated eyes, for a moment I thought it was May, the same dark hairstyle, the same slender figure, and then she turned. Not Asian features like May, something completely different but just as attractive, if not more beautiful. She had a Mediterranean appearance, large dark eyes and full, sensual lips. Younger, Penelope Cruz but slimmer. The striking resemblance to May from behind initially caught my attention, but her beauty froze me. Eventually, she noticed my paralyzed contemplation and looked at me first with surprise, then with wariness, and then she turned back to the people she was with. I stood in the center of the tavern, motionless. Finally, a random jolt brought me back to reality. Still looking at her, I slowly walked over to my original table where Maria was sitting. I was almost ready to sit down, still glancing at the woman, when she turned to me and smiled slightly. Maria started talking and touching me a little, continuing the conversation we had before I went to the restroom, but I realized that I no longer had the energy for this. I looked at the warm, pleasant woman, Maria, and although she was not unattractive, she was physically no comparison to the woman I had seen. She may have sensed the change in my mood. In her defense, she tried. She leaned over, kissed me on the cheek, and whispered an invitation to take her home. Of course, I knew what it meant, and although my physical attraction was strong, I was not emotionally interested. I refused her as kindly as possible, and her mood changed from surprise to anger. I felt sorry. Here was this sweet, ordinary girl offering herself to me, and I rejected her. Suddenly, she stood up, and several others stood up too, and everyone left. I received a sharp, angry look from Gina, my coworker, on the way out. It was time for me to leave too, but I had an irresistible desire to meet the beautiful woman I had seen. I stood up and looked around the tavern, spotting her again with a small group of people at a table at the far end. Without a plan, I approached the group, looking at the woman. I walked over to their table, and for a moment their conversation continued, oblivious to my presence. Finally, a bearded man at the table, probably in his early 40s, 10 years older than me, noticed me and nodded. I nodded in response and extended my hand to the woman. She looked at my hand, then at me, and finally took my hand. For a moment, I introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Devin Baxter. I work at Santo Spa," I told her. "Gabriella," she answered quietly, her eyes meeting mine before turning away. The bearded man moved over and offered me a chair, and I sat down. I received a smile from an older woman, who I assumed was John's wife. The group continued the conversation they had been having before my intrusion, mostly in Greek. I sat there, content to be in Gabriella's presence. For a moment, I tried not to look at her, but it was difficult. Several times she caught me and smiled. After a while, the tone of the conversation changed, and the group stood up. Not knowing what to do, I also stood up. The bearded man, John, raised his hand as if to say goodbye. Quickly, I moved closer to Gabriella. "It was nice to meet you, Gabriella," I told her. She stopped and said, "Goodbye, Devin," and turned to leave. "Gabriella," I said, and she turned. "Will you be here next week?" "Perhaps," she stopped and answered me, then walked away. That week at work, my thoughts were on the beautiful Gabriella. As the week went on, I decided that I needed to find out more about her. Gina didn't talk to me anymore after I rejected her friend Maria, but I had another source. Grigos knew who I was talking about when I asked him about her. Her father, Suaz, owns a grocery store on the mainland, he told me. Grigos said that she brings fresh vegetables to the spa and the small village store. She usually comes once a week. He was not aware of any boyfriends or suitors, he said. She delivers fruits and vegetables on Fridays, often stays overnight, and returns to the mainland on Saturday. That Friday night, I was at the tavern again, this time sitting at the bar. As a sign of friendship, I ordered drinks for Gina and Maria's table. I received several raised glasses and gestures of gratitude, no smiles, but no obvious hostility either. It was about 9 o'clock when I saw her again with John, the bearded man, his wife, and several others. As soon as they sat down, I sent drinks for this group too. When the waiter brought the drinks and spoke briefly with John, he turned to me, smiled, and waved for me to join. We sat down, and again the conversation around me was in a language that I did not understand very well. A little later, Gabriella turned to me. "How do you like Santo Island?" she asked. We soon found ourselves in our own private conversation while the others chatted among themselves. I learned about the family's fruit and vegetable business, and Grigos had told me that Friday was Gabriella's usual delivery day in Santo. I asked where she stayed in Santo on Fridays, and she gave me a noncommittal answer. At one point, she stood up to use the restroom, and John turned to me. "Be careful around Gabriella," he said. I asked him to explain his warning, and all I got out of him was that she was fragile. I felt like a fine sculpture, beautiful but requiring careful handling. Once again, the group stood up to leave. At the same time, I gently grabbed Gabriella's forearm. This surprised her, and she quickly inhaled at my touch. Then she turned to me with an expression somewhere between fear and surprise. "Can I walk you home?" I asked, not knowing where her home might be for the night. She nodded silently. John, his wife, and the others walked along the rocky path into the village while Gabriella and I walked slowly behind them. Part of the way, I felt her small, warm hand squeeze mine. It was like an electric shock where we touched. I'd heard of being struck by lightning, but I always thought it was just melodrama. But no, it was real. I also felt that she felt it too. Slowly, my thumb stroked the top of her arm, not aggressively, just feeling the connection between us as we walked along the path in the faint moonlight. I felt like we were the only people on Earth. Eventually, John and Eve stopped at the door of one of the many cottages around the village. John turned and said something to Gabriella in Greek that I didn't understand. She answered briefly, and John and Eve entered the cottage while the others continued on their way. The door was cracked open, and Gabriella slowed, then stopped at the door. She turned to me and looked into my eyes. "Hello, Devin," she told me quietly, almost in a whisper, then leaned toward me and kissed me on the cheek. I couldn't resist. As she turned to enter the cottage, I put my arm around her and held her close. Then she suddenly pulled away and walked quickly to the cottage door as if in a hurry. Surprised, I stood and watched as she entered. Did I offend her? Had I gone too far? But as soon as she closed the door, she turned and smiled at me, letting me know that everything was okay. I walked along the path back to my small apartment, lost in thought. Ever since May's accident, I hadn't been particularly interested in any kind of relationship. The scars from my marriage and financial failure weighed heavily on me, but suddenly my feelings began to change. I felt positive about life. I began to stop questioning the path my life was taking. Of course, the magical island of Santo helped put out the fire of my divorce and financial ruin, but there was more to it than that. I knew it was too early to think about it, but I couldn't help myself. I was falling in love with Gabriella. These thoughts kept me awake until finally, physical exhaustion forced me to sleep. The next day was Saturday, and I was somewhat surprised to find that I had an invitation to dinner with Leonidas Kanakis. The note read 9 p.m. on the north veranda. I felt light on this sunny Saturday afternoon. The darkness of the recent episodes of my life was receding. I felt positive and optimistic. I was looking forward to dinner with Kanakis, but what lifted my spirits the most was my growing friendship with Gabriella. With this new energy, I decided to explore. I started walking down to the small beach in front of the spa. Several guests were swimming, and I waved to them. After walking a short trail, I found the pier where Kanakis' boat was moored. It was a 40-foot sea ray that accommodated a small group of people and was beautiful. I remembered my experiences with boats and the boats I had owned. I loved sailing and hoped to ride on that boat one day. I noticed he called it Hermes V. In front of the boat, on the dock, sat a beat-up Yamaha jet ski that looked shabby. I had not seen such water transport on the island before. Sometimes such things are prohibited. I inspected the boat and noticed that it needed a little maintenance, not much, but it just seemed like she wasn't being looked after as well as she should be. One thing was for sure, I thought as I studied Hermes V, the trip back to the mainland would be much faster than the ferry. Beyond the jetty, past the jet ski, the beach became rocky, and I saw a small path that went inland, away from the water, through the bush. Following the path, it seemed to end at a drop of about 4 feet to a small patch of sand. I almost turned back around, but I saw some roots from twisted trees. I grabbed one, then the other, and jumped the last 2 feet onto the soft sand. Beyond this piece, it seemed the trail continued. I followed a barely visible path and climbed over a rocky ledge. When I came out the other side, I was surprised at what I found, a beautiful crescent of sand, and beyond it, the deepest blue-green calm lagoon sea I had ever seen. It was like a beautiful little gem, and there wasn't a soul on the beach, so close, yet hidden. I went down, took off my shoes, and rolled up my pants. The warm water felt refreshing on my bare feet. I turned my back to the sea and looked at the landscape. Because of the steep bank, I could only see the highest parts of Kanakis' house. The spa was not visible from this remote bay. Tired, I took off my shirt and sat down on the fine white sand. The heat and exertion made me drowsy, and I fell into a light sleep. I finally got up and quickly scanned the area, seeing no one. I took off the rest of my clothes and dove into the clear water. Something about the water on my skin was simply sensual. The feeling was indescribable. I felt weightless, as if small hands were holding me afloat effortlessly. I enjoyed the water and the sensation of floating in the sea. I finally got out, dried off in the warm sun, got dressed, and headed back. I felt the urge to tell someone about my discovery of this hidden bay, but after thinking about it, I selfishly decided to keep it a secret. As I walked, I knew I wanted to share this discovery with someone, and it didn't take me long to figure out who: Gabriella. That night, I arrived at Kanakis' house a little before 9 o'clock. Under the arch, I saw the Emir standing quietly in the shadows. I greeted him good-naturedly, and in response, I received a short nod without expression on his sullen face. Kanakis, on the other hand, crossed the stone floor with a smile and great energy. "Devin, my friend," he greeted me, grabbing my outstretched hands in his. "Welcome. Welcome. How are you finding life on Santo?" he asked enthusiastically. I explained that everything was fine and that I was enjoying the experience. He nodded vigorously, happy man, satisfied with life. I told him that I saw his Hermes V today and complimented it. "Are you familiar with boats?" he asked. I told him I had some experience, and he asked if I had ever worked on boats. I said that I had been sailing since childhood and, until recently, had my own boat. Then he added that he did all the maintenance on his boats himself. "I'm having trouble with my Hermes engine," he said. "Would you mind taking a look at it?" I said I'd be happy to take a look the next day. At that moment, the same silent waitress brought our dinner dishes, and we ate in silence for several minutes. "I have a deep respect for the water, the beautiful Mediterranean Sea," Kanaki said, looking out at the magnificent view. Then he told me a story. Many years ago, he was on a small boat returning to the mainland alone. The boat began to take on water, and Kanaki's was eventually forced to abandon it and use a small inflatable boat. When the boat sank, Devon, he told me, "I don't know how many days I was adrift at sea. All the water I had quickly ran out, and I had no food. The sun was merciless, slowly boiling me alive. I never knew such pain." He said that at one point, the torment he endured was too much. I was ready to jump overboard and end my life by plunging into the sea. I told myself I wanted to see one last sunset before I died. As I looked west to see the beauty of the end of my last day, I couldn't believe my eyes. A ship was coming straight towards me. I tried to scream to get their attention, but I had no voice. It didn't matter, they saw me and saved me. I was so grateful. "But, Devon," he said, looking into my eyes, I realized at that moment that I was no longer afraid of death, and I realized that at some point in our lives, there comes a time when death becomes preferable to the suffering of life. I sat pondering his story and his thoughts on death and life. I wondered what the point of this story was. Eventually, the evening took its course, and we drank ouzo quietly and calmly. At the end of our dinner, I again had the impression that, no matter what I said, no matter how much I participated in the conversation, his interest in what I said was minimal. "Have a nice evening, my friend," Kanaki stated. "One thing is true," he continued with a more serious expression. "I have learned that you have met Gabriella at Sufo, the daughter of my good friend Ambrosio Suaz." I nodded silently, wondering how he knew about this. "Please, as a friend," he told me seriously, "be careful with her. She is beautiful but inexperienced. There are things you don't know about her. I wouldn't want Gabriella to get hurt." I sat at the table thinking about it. Things I don't know? Which things? Several questions for Kanaki's on this topic came to mind, but before I could ask any, he stood up, wished me good night, and, with the same energy with which he entered, quickly left. I continued to sit, immersed in the strange evening, and perhaps would have sat longer, but I saw the huge shadow of the Emir moving toward the veranda where I was sitting. The message was quite clear: time to leave. The next day, Sunday, Lydia brought me the keys to Kanaki's boat, the Hermes V. Along with the keys were maintenance instructions. I was surprised and a little unhappy. Now it seemed my job included maintaining his boat. I thought about the strange but not unpleasant evening with Kanaki's, the story of his survival at sea, and his comments about Gabriella. How did he know about my friendship, if that's what you can call it at this stage, with her? I didn't know Kanaki's very well, but I began to form an opinion. These thoughts were running through my head as I approached his boat, the Hermes V. I inspected it, and as I noted earlier, it was in need of some light maintenance. I compiled a list of required parts and materials. I inspected the engine, and it also needed general maintenance. I checked the cooling system. Internal wiring was showing signs of wear. I also noticed early signs of heat damage on the engine. No wonder the boat performed poorly. It was a fire trap waiting to happen. I took the Hermes for a short ride and felt the mechanical problems Kanaki's was trying to describe. Returning to the dock, I examined the engine again, definitely overheated. I determined what parts would be needed to fix the heating problem. Later, I gave Lydia my order list from the mainland. As I left, I remembered that I forgot to tell her to limit her use of the Hermes until the renovations were completed. Well, I thought, they don't seem to use the boat much, everything should be fine. The week went by quickly. Again, I had an endless to-do list. Lydia prioritized projects by importance. One thing that changed was that I was now expected to service the Hermes V, too. On Tuesday morning, one of my tasks was to polish the brass on the boat. Suddenly, Friday came. I was looking forward to meeting Gabriella at the tavern. This was the highlight of my week. My weariness and negative attitude toward the opposite night disappeared thanks to the time spent with Gabriella. But there was more to it than that. The months following my divorce from May felt like a dark cloak dragging me down into a negative hole. I trusted May, and then she betrayed me with David Chan. To make matters worse, her father betrayed me in our business agreement. I had reasons to be negative, and suddenly I met Gabriella, like a bright light. Our brief interactions pulled me out of this dark hole. I asked myself, am I getting ahead of myself? After all, I've only seen her a few times. Calm down, I told myself. But then I remembered our kiss at the cottage door. I felt something, and I knew she felt it too. I freshened up after work on Friday and arrived at the tavern earlier than usual. I was in a good mood, happy, and it seemed that others were, too. Even Maria, whom I had rejected a few weeks ago, smiled at me and waved. Like clockwork, John, Eve, and a couple of others entered the tavern with Gabriella. I saw her look around the tavern, then saw me, smiled, and walked over to where I was sitting at the bar. "Devin," she said, and kissed me on the cheek. I felt the electricity again as her lips touched mine. "Come sit down with me." I was warmly welcomed into the group when we sat down. At first, it was general conversation, but eventually, Gabriella and I focused on our conversation. As it got late, the tavern became noisy. "It's getting a little hard to talk. Do you want to go for a walk?" I asked. Immediately, she looked at me with an almost worried expression before answering. She leaned toward Eve, raised her hand to her ear, and began a short conversation. Eve listened, then raised her hand and whispered something back to Gabriella. I saw Gabriella nod as Eve spoke. At some point, her eyes flickered to me. Finally, their private conversation ended, and Gabriella stood up. "Looks like I passed some kind of test," I thought. Funny, I thought Gabriella must be at least 25 years old. Why did she seem to need permission to walk with me? We walked along the rocky path back to Santos's spa. I thought it would be too early to invite her to my small apartment. Moreover, my modest home was far from impressive. We ended up on Santos's beach. It was dark, and I saw several guests enjoying the moonlight and the sea. Gabriella squeezed my hand. I wanted to show her the secret cove I found, but it would be too difficult to navigate at night. We walked to the end of the beach, where a rocky ledge turned into a pier where Hermes V was moored. We turned, and I hugged Gabriella. She turned to me, and I held her close. It was the same feeling I had had the first time. I don't know how long we stood in that dark corner of the beach kissing. Our bodies were pressed closely together. "We should go back," she said, lowering her eyes in embarrassment. "Gabriella," I said, and she looked up. "It's okay. I care about you. You're important to me. I'll be patient with you. It's just," I told her, "you're so beautiful. I want you." This brought a smile to her face. "Devin," she paused and said quietly as we walked back along the beach, "I want you too." She looked at me again, turned, and kissed me on the cheek, laughing. I remembered my first school experiences mishandling the mysteries of intim and the female body, but there were also new emotional experiences associated with the physical ones. Using a nautical analogy, I felt like I was steering a ship into unknown waters with Gabriella. Of course, from the point of view of intimate experience, these things were not new to me. I was married. But because of Gabriella's innocence, I felt as if I, too, was going through these experiences all over again. Partway back, I asked her about Kanakis. "How well do you know him, and what do you think of him?" "I've known Leon all my life," she said. "He has been doing business with our family for many years. He employs many people in Santos and does a lot of good for the islanders who live here." I digested her words. What Gabriella said matched what I observed, but the questions I really wanted answered, I didn't know how to ask her. What did Kanakis mean when he said there are things you don't know about Gabriella? "Did he tell you about the masquerade?" she asked, smiling. I told her no. I hadn't heard of a masquerade. What is it? I asked. She told me it was a big annual party at Kanakis' house. A masquerade? She explained a little more and said that he would be there soon. As we approached the tavern, I stopped just before we entered. Gabriella, I began, next week, can you spend all day with me on Saturday? I would like to, she said, smiling at me. I'll ask Dad. At that moment, John, Eve, and the others left the tavern. Gabriella turned and gave me a warm but brief kiss on the lips. Goodbye, Devin, she whispered to me. See you next week. My thoughts that week revolved around meeting Gabriella and spending the day with her the following Saturday. Meanwhile, I carried out my regular duties maintaining the Santos spa. On Wednesday, Lydia brought me the parts one ordered for the Hermes V. I spent the entire day replacing the fuel regulator in the engine bay. I removed the old one and saw signs of erosion on it. It was dangerous to the point that it could cause a fire. After 2 hours of trying to install the new harness, I came to the conclusion that Lydia ordered the wrong part. I posted a warning sign indicating that use should be restricted until the repairs were completed. This was what I always did when working on boats. Now there was no regulator on the fuel line. I tried to explain this to Lydia and then gave her the exact name of the part to order. On Friday evening, I went to the tavern. I arrived a little early, hoping that Gabriella would arrive earlier than usual. She wasn't there, but that wasn't unusual. Usually, she and John, Eve, and that group came after 8. By 9:30, my curiosity about their absence had turned to disappointment tinged with anger. At 10, I left and went to the village of Pears. I wasn't exactly sure which cottage was John and Eve's home, where I walked with Gabriella one day. I felt stupid knocking on the door at this time of night, especially since I wasn't sure if I was at the right place. I knocked quietly. Silence. I tried again, there was no answer. I stood there, not knowing what to do next. I soon realized that I really had no choice. The way home was filled with thoughts about my disappointment and desire to see Gabriella. Did something happen? Was there any logical explanation? Why didn't she contact me? I came to the conclusion that she could not contact me for the same reason that I did not contact her. We didn't have each other's phone numbers. I decided that in the morning, I would go back to Paris and try to find John and Eve. I would then ask for Gabriella's contact information. Okay, I thought, at least I have a plan. On Saturday morning, I walked along the trail to Paris. I wandered through the small town center and past the cluster of cottages where I thought John and Eve lived. I even went to a small grocery store. I wondered if their vegetable delivery was late, but no, the vegetables looked fresh. Just as I was about to leave, suddenly, I heard a voice calling me. It was Grigos, the cleaner from the Santos spa. We talked, and as always, Grigos had a big smile on his face. We spent a few minutes discussing the weather, work, and a few general topics. Finally, I brought up the topic of Gabriella. You know Gabriella, the woman who delivers fruits and vegetables? I began. He studied me for a moment, processing my question. Yes, a very beautiful girl, he said, his smile becoming wider. Have you seen her recently? I asked. Grigos paused, his eyes darting skyward, his thumb and forefingers stroking his chin in thought as he processed my question. Suddenly, he snapped his fingers and said, I saw her yesterday. Where? I asked him, urgency in my voice. He told me that he saw Gabriella walking up the steps to Kanakis' house on Friday afternoon. I guessed I was working on the boat and didn't notice it. I asked Grigos a few follow-up questions, but he didn't know any other details. I thanked him and headed back to the spa. On the way, I decided to try to talk to Kanakis. My excuse was that I wanted to inform him about the condition of Hermes V, and then I would find a way to mention Gabriella. I walked past guests doing yoga, stretching, and calisthenics, then past the dining area and up the stairs to the top floor where Kanakis lived. I felt a little awkward arriving here uninvited, but I needed to find out about Gabriella. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again. I stood in silence waiting and was about to leave when the door suddenly opened. It was Amir. If anything, his aggressively negative expression became even more obvious. I asked to speak with Kanakis. Without answering, he closed the door almost with a bang. I stood there, not knowing if he understood what I asked. He didn't say anything. A few minutes later, the door opened again, Amir again, with a gloomy face. He nodded towards the veranda and pointed to a small table overlooking the sea. I sat down, waiting, and I waited. It must have been about 30 minutes before Kanakis appeared with the same energy and smile, but the expression on his face was not as warm as in previous meetings. After minimal greetings, he spoke. "Devin," he began, "what do you want to discuss today?" "Saturday," he asked. I started telling him about the problems with the Hermes V and what I was doing to fix them. He seemed bored, impatient, looking at his phone several times, clearly uninterested in the details. I was almost sure that he understood almost nothing I said. "This is all?" he asked, his good-natured expression visibly weakening. I nodded. "In the future," he began, "such issues can be resolved with Lydia," he said, and then he stood up. I got up too. "One more thing," I said as he turned around. "I was curious if you've seen Gabriella in the last day or two." He stared at me for a full minute, looking at me without saying a word, not an iota of friendliness on his face. "I already told you she is fragile and inexperienced. Please remember that," he said and quickly left. He never answered my question, and I almost followed Kanakis into the house, but before I did, I saw Amir watching me, ready for action. Reluctantly, I turned and walked back to my room, angry and confused. My joyful mood of the past weeks had disappeared. I had let my feelings get out of control with thoughts of Gabriella, and now I was unsure of her feelings. She said she wanted me, but I wondered what had happened to her last week. The fact that Grigos saw her near Kanakis' house proved that she was on the island. On Tuesday, I had 2 projects on the boat. The first was to oil the main deck and then wash the life jacket covers. While I was oiling the deck, Kanakis appeared out of nowhere. "Devin," he greeted me with a smiling face. "The Hermes looks great, almost like new," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Just remember," I began, "I still have to replace the regulator harness." He nodded, half listening to what I was saying. "Devin, one more thing," he said, changing the subject. "There's a masquerade coming up at the spa. We want the grounds to be in tip-top shape for the event. Lydia will keep you posted." I nodded as he started to walk away. "And Devin, of course, my friend, without a doubt your presence is required," he said, smiling. "I think you'll enjoy our annual masquerade." The rest of the week passed slowly with daily routines. I often used my construction skills to fix things, but sometimes I felt like a glorified janitor. Today was one of those days when I was taking life jackets to the laundry. Finally, Friday came. I really needed to see Gabriella and wondered if I would be disappointed again. By 8 o'clock, I was at the tavern. It was too early for her to arrive. Once again, I sent drinks to Maria, Gina, and their friends. It seemed that hostile feelings had begun to subside, and then suddenly, Gabriella was there, alone next to me, no John, no Eve, just her with a worried expression on her face. She ordered a glass of wine. "Devin, I'm so sorry about last week," she said urgently. "I really tried to come and wanted to spend Saturday with you. I'm sorry." She held my forearm, and the electric sensation of her touch was as strong as ever. I was glad she was here, but I felt like I deserved some kind of explanation about her whereabouts last Friday. I asked her what happened. I knew she was in Santos, but Grigos saw her. Where was she? What was she doing? "Oh, Devin," she began, "let's not talk about this right now. I'm just so glad we're together." She tightened her grip on my forearm, and then before I could ask any more questions, she finished her wine and stood up. "Devin, let's go outside and take a walk." It was light out, and the temperature was still warm, around 80 degrees. Our route took us away from Pears and back to the spa. We reached the spa beach, and Gabriella took off her sandals and walked into the warm, ankle-deep sea. "Oh, Devin, the water feels so good," she said, smiling. I was glad to see her happy. The evening was simply wonderful. There were several spa guests on the beach enjoying the setting, and then a thought came to me. Yes, it's still light enough, I thought. Come on, I told her, put on your sandals. Where do, she began. I grabbed her hand, and we climbed over the ledge. We then followed a rarely used path to a point where we had to jump down onto the sand and then jump over a rock barrier again. Where are we going? She asked. I simply told her she would see soon and led her down the path. Having climbed over the last barrier, we found ourselves in a secret little cove. The sun was already setting, but there was still enough light to enjoy the beauty of the surroundings. I looked at Gabriella, and she was smiling. She hugged me, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Devin, it's so beautiful here, she exclaimed. We walked to the water, and again, Gabriella took off her sandals and walked into the water. The water here, she began, feels different, warmer, but not only that. I can't explain it. The sea here is simply amazing. These were the same feelings I had when I first discovered this bay. We were alone on the beach, the light was fading, but the warmth of the day was still felt. Without thinking, I took off my shirt, kicked off my shoes, and in my underwear, I ran into the sea and dove in. It was the same magical feeling, sensual and refreshing. I swam and enjoyed the sensation. I turned towards the beach and was surprised and happy at what I saw. Gabriella, completely without anything, walked into the sea. Her beauty took my breath away. You were looking at me, she said, smiling and pretending to cover herself. Silently, I approached her. The sight of her made me completely aroused. The material of my underwear stretched as the water became shallow. My night arousal became apparent. Gabriella's eyes flickered down and saw my condition. We hugged in knee-deep water, her body pressed tightly against mine. We swam and swam, enjoying the sensation. Gabriella then turned away from the shore and with fast, strong strokes quickly found herself in the depths. I was amazed at how fast she swam. Wow! I said when she returned. She laughed and told me she was on her town swim team. I was third place at the national competition, she said proudly. I was impressed. Slowly but surely, I began to get to know Gabriella better. After some time, we left the water. The warm air felt pleasant on our bare skin. I turned and kissed her, and she pressed herself against me. My lips touched her. We started making love. Devin, no, she exclaimed, breaking free, breaking our contact. She hurriedly got up and began to quickly get dressed. Gabriella, what happened? I asked. I saw silent tears on her cheeks. She simply shook her head, not saying a word as she continued to get dressed. I stood nearby, without clothes, not understanding what had happened. 1 minute we were making love, and the next, she suddenly stopped and seemed upset. Finally, slowly, I started to get dressed. Do you want to go back? I asked her quietly, and she nodded in response. We walked out of the small cove in silence, up the path, and back to the spa beach. Halfway to the tavern, her hand found mine. I looked at her, but her eyes were downcast. We were already on our way to the tavern when I said I was sorry. She didn't answer. I told her that I hoped she didn't feel like I was forcing her into something that made her feel uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. Devin, she began, I care about you, but I'm scared, she said almost in a whisper. I'm not used to, and fell silent, offering no other explanation. As we walked, I felt like I understood her unexpressed feelings. I knew she lived a sheltered life. I had heard about it from Kanakis and others. She was a beautiful woman who had probably attracted men in her life, and she may have had unwanted experiences that made her wary. I believed that she had feelings for me, but her intimate experience was something I had to approach slowly. Although my desire for her was strong, I was willing to sacrifice my physical desire for a more important emotional connection. Eventually, we arrived at the tavern. Gabriella turned to me. I have to go. I'll find John and Eve, she said, but I will see you soon. She said softly, then hugged me and kissed me deeply. Slowly, she pulled away, gave me a shy smile, and entered the tavern. What do you think of our story today? It seems to me that all the first installments are designed in such a way that the most interesting part of the story is at the end. What's your impression of the story? Let me know in the comments. See you in the comments.